You will not have her. She is a Thompson. She has a duty. The voice was an axe through wood, sharp and splintering, accustomed to felling anything that stood in its path. But the man it was aimed at was not wood. He was stone. He did not move, did not even flinch. He simply stood, a mountain in the suffocating heat of the mayor's office, his shadow falling over the small woman beside him. She has a name, the giant gunslinger replied, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, and she made her choice. This is a story about a girl who was given a name but never a voice, a house but never a home. It's about the choices we make when we think we have none left, and the people who finally see us when we have spent a lifetime being invisible. If you've ever felt overlooked, this story is for you. And if you believe in the strength found in the quietest corners, then you know what happened next didn't just shock a town, it built a new world. The flashback began not with a sound, but with a feeling. The rough, worn cotton of a light blue prairie dress sticking to An Lee's back in the oppressive summer heat. Her world was measured in chores. It was the grit of dust under her fingernails, the ache in her spine from scrubbing floors that were never clean enough, the sting of lye soap on her chapped hands. At 18, she was a ghost in her own father's house, a faded photograph from a life he'd rather forget. Her Chinese mother was a whisper, a collection of memories An Lee clung to like precious jewels. The scent of ginger, the soft cadence of a language no one else in Redemption Creek spoke, the feel of her cool hand on a fevered brow. But her mother was gone, and in her place was Beatrice, her father's new wife, a woman built of sharp angles and sharper words. And there was Clara, her stepsister, 4 years older and a world away, a creature of lace and laughter and casual cruelty, the golden daughter of Mayor Thompson, the sun around which the entire household revolved. An Lee was the shadow, the necessary but unseen mechanism that kept the sun shining. The town of Redemption Creek baked under the relentless glare of the August sun, its single dusty street a testament to the harshness of the land. Buildings of raw lumber slumped against each other for support, their facades weathered to the color of bone. At the end of this street, set apart and above, was the mayor's house, a 2-story white monument to prosperity and power, its porch shaded and its windows clean because An Lee had wiped away the ever-present dust before dawn. It was from this porch that she first saw him. Grant rode into town not with a thunder of hooves, but with a quiet deliberation that drew more eyes than any loud arrival ever could. He was immense, a man whose frame seemed to test the limits of his saddle leather. He moved with a slow, powerful grace, his gaze sweeping over the town not with arrogance, but with a deep, unnerving stillness, as if he were weighing and measuring every soul he saw. He was here, the whispers said, to buy the vast tract of land east of the creek, a deal that would make Mayor Thompson an even more powerful man. An Lee was returning from the well, the wooden yoke digging into her shoulders, the twin buckets of water sloshing with every pained step. She kept her eyes down, the way she was taught. Invisibility was safety. But the ground was uneven, a loose stone turning under her worn-out boot. She stumbled, a sharp cry escaping her lips as the yoke tilted precariously. Before she could fall, a hand, huge and steady, caught her arm. Another hand secured the yoke. She looked up into the calmest gray eyes she had ever seen. He said nothing, simply held her steady until she found her footing. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second to her hands, red and raw from work, gripping the wood. It was a look of assessment, of understanding. He saw the calluses. He saw the truth of her life in them. A sharp voice cut through the moment. "An Lee, stop dawdling!" Mayor Thompson stood on the porch, his face a thundercloud of disapproval. Grant released her, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer before he gave a slow, deliberate nod to her father. An-Lee scurried away, the weight of the water forgotten, her skin burning where he had touched her, her mind reeling from the shock of being seen. The dinner was an elaborate affair designed to impress and to deceive. The dining room gleamed, the silver polished by An-Lee to a mirror shine, the crystal goblets refracting the candlelight. Mayor Thompson was in his element, holding court, his voice booming as he spoke of the town's boundless future. Grant sat opposite him, a quiet monolith, listening more than he spoke, his eyes missing nothing. An-Lee moved silently around the table, refilling wine glasses, replacing plates, her presence as unnoticed as the motes of dust dancing in the candle flames. Her father was laying the trap, his words smooth and persuasive. "The parcel bordering the river is prime land, Grant. Flat, fertile, ready for cultivation." He gestured expansively with a well-fed hand. "A smart investment for a man like you." An-Lee's blood ran cold. She knew that land. Her mother had taken her there as a child. It was flood-prone, the soil thin and salty, a place where only the toughest weeds grew. The real prize, the land her father was carefully omitting from the conversation, was the rocky plateau to the east. It looked like a wasteland, but her mother, with her deep ancient knowledge of the earth, had shown her the secrets it held. She had pointed out the clusters of deep-rooted willow herbs, the subtle depressions in the earth, the way the rocks held the morning dew. "Water sleeps here," her mother had whispered, "deep and sweet. You just have to know how to wake it." Later, after the cloying sweetness of Beatrice's prized dessert had been served, An-Lee found Grant on the porch, staring out into the moon-drenched darkness. A map was spread on the railing beside him. The lie her father had told was a physical weight in her chest. For years she had survived on silence, on making herself small. But her mother's memory, the injustice of the lie, it sparked a tiny, terrifying flame of rebellion. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She took a step, then another, her worn boots making no sound on the wooden planks. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging her presence without surprise. She stopped beside him, her hands clenched in the folds of her blue dress. With a trembling finger she reached out and pointed not to the riverland, but to the barren-looking plot her father was so carefully ignoring. "The water isn't there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's here." Grant's gaze shifted from the map to her face. In the pale moonlight, her expression was one of fierce, desperate sincerity. There was no guile in her eyes, only a truth that seemed to cost her everything to speak. He could have dismissed her, a servant girl with fanciful notions. Many men would have. But Grant had built his life on reading people, on seeing past the surface to the bedrock beneath. He saw the strength in her that her own family was blind to. "Show me," he said. The two words were not a command, but a challenge, an offer. They hung in the air between them, heavy with risk and possibility. For An-Lee it was a precipice. To defy her father so openly was unthinkable. The consequences would be severe. Yet the thought of returning to her life of silent servitude, of letting this lie stand, was a different kind of death. She met his gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. Before the sun had even begun to hint at its arrival, she was gone, a small bundle of her few belongings clutched in her hand. She met him at the edge of town where he waited with 2 horses. They rode in silence as the sky bled from purple to pink, the air still cool against their skin. She led him away from the river, up into the rocky, scrub-covered hills that everyone in Redemption Creek considered worthless. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them, but An-Lee seemed undaunted. She moved with a quiet purpose, reading the landscape like a book written in a language only she and her mother knew. Finally, she stopped and dismounted in a shallow basin surrounded by granite outcroppings. "Here," she said. She picked up a fallen branch and walked to a spot where a patch of stubborn, dark green weeds grew. She began to scrape away the dry topsoil. Grant watched, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. After a few inches, the earth changed color, becoming dark and damp. She dug her fingers into it, pulling up a clump of rich, cool soil that smelled of life. "The rain runs off the rocks," she explained, her voice gaining confidence. "It collects under this clay. It never dries out. My mother said this is the heart of the land. The water is deep, but it's here." He knelt, taking some of the soil from her. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, his skepticism melting away in the face of such simple, undeniable proof. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a servant, but a strategist, a survivor, a woman of profound and hidden worth. "I'm setting up a camp to survey this land properly," he said, his voice serious. "I need someone who understands it. I'll pay you a fair wage. You'll have your own tent, your own life." It wasn't a proposal of marriage or a romantic declaration. It was something far more valuable. It was an offer of respect, an escape, a choice. The decision was made in the space of a single drawn-out breath. To stay was to remain a ghost. To go was to become a person. "Yes," An-Li said, the word feeling new and powerful on her tongue. When they returned to the mayor's house, the confrontation was as ugly as she had anticipated. Her father's face purpled with rage. Beatrice looked at her with cold contempt, while Clara watched with a smirk, already savoring the story of An-Li's spectacular failure. "You will do no such thing," Mayor Thompson thundered, stepping in front of her. "You are my daughter. You will not shame this family by running off to work in a camp full of ruffians." But Grant moved to stand beside her, his sheer size a silent rebuttal to her father's authority. "She is a grown woman," he stated calmly, "and I have hired her for her expertise. She will be treated with respect." The word expertise hung in the air, a concept so foreign in relation to An-Li that her father was momentarily stunned into silence. Defeated, he spat on the ground near her feet. "Go then, but when you come crawling back, don't expect this door to be open to you." An-Li didn't look back. The camp was a raw, chaotic collection of tents and wagons, populated by a dozen hard-faced men. The foreman, a grizzled man named Gus, with eyes like chips of flint, looked An-Li up and down with open disbelief when Grant introduced her as his new geological consultant. Gus grunted, clearly unimpressed. "She's just a girl. What's she know about finding water?" An-Li didn't try to argue. She knew words would mean nothing here. Only work mattered. So she worked. She rose before the men, her days spent walking the land, marking her map with the signs her mother had taught her. She showed them where the ground was softest to dig, where the natural drainage channels lay, how to predict the sudden, violent summer storms by the behavior of the insects. At first, they ignored her or treated her as a strange mascot. But when her advice led them to a steady, reliable water source on the third day, saving them hours of fruitless digging under the blistering sun, the whispers started to change. Gus watched her, his expression a mixture of confusion and grudging admiration. She never complained, never shirked the hardest tasks. She was quiet, tireless, and she was always right. One evening, a younger man mockingly called her the Water Witch. The name stuck, but its meaning shifted day by day, from an insult to a title of respect. Gus finally acknowledged her directly, tipping his hat as she passed. "Ma'am," he said. It was a small gesture, but for An-Li it felt like a coronation. The harsh edges of camp life began to soften into a routine, a community. An-Li found a rhythm she had never known, one dictated by the sun and the needs of the land, not the whims of her family. The evenings became her favorite time. The brutal heat of the day would finally break, and a cool breeze would whisper down from the high rocks. She and Grant would often sit by the fire after the other men had retired, the flickering light casting long shadows. It was in these quiet moments that their bond deepened. He was a man of few words, but he was a masterful listener. He asked her about her mother, not out of pity, but with genuine curiosity. An Lee, who had kept those memories locked away for so long, found herself opening up, sharing the stories, the folklore, the deep, practical wisdom her mother had imparted. She spoke of a world of balance and respect for the earth, a philosophy that resonated with the quiet gunslinger who had seen too much of men taking and destroying. In turn, he spoke of his life, of the cities he'd left behind, of his weariness with greed and noise. He was searching for something real, a place to build, not just to profit. He saw the world in a way An Lee understood. He didn't just look at the land, he saw its history, its potential, its spirit. One evening he presented her with a small wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a finely sharpened pencil. "For your observations," he said simply. It was the most thoughtful gift she had ever received. It wasn't a trinket to make her prettier. It was a tool to honor her mind. It was a declaration that her thoughts had value. While this new life blossomed for An Lee, a storm was gathering back in Redemption Creek. Mayor Thompson was incandescent with rage. Grant, following An Lee's guidance, had formally purchased the worthless plateau, and the initial surveys were proving it to be far more valuable than anyone had imagined. The mayor's attempt at deception had backfired spectacularly, making him a laughingstock. His power, built on intimidation and the perception of shrewdness, was threatened. He began to retaliate. The regular supply wagon from town suddenly stopped coming, citing unforeseen shortages. Men who had agreed to work at the camp were threatened with losing their other jobs. Vicious rumors began to circulate about An Lee, painting her as a harlot who had bewitched the giant gunslinger. The pressure was immense, a siege designed to starve them out and break their will. The sabotage escalated from petty obstruction to outright malice. It was Gus who found it. He went to the main well at dawn, the well An Lee had helped them locate, the one that had become the lifeblood of the camp. He lowered the bucket and brought it up, but the water was cloudy, slick with a greasy, foul-smelling substance. Someone had deliberately poisoned their water source during the night. The news ripped through the camp, bringing work to a halt. Panic, the dry, choking panic of men stranded in an unforgiving land, began to take hold. This was more than an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for the project. It would take weeks to dig a new well, time and money they didn't have. The men looked to Grant, their faces grim. For the first time, An Lee saw a flicker of doubt in his steady eyes. He was a fighter, a strategist, but this was a different kind of warfare. He was being bled dry, his every move countered by an unseen enemy. All their progress, all their hard work, was turning to poison in a single bucket. Despair settled over the camp like a shroud. Gus kicked at the contaminated earth. "It's the mayor. Has to be. He's trying to break us." While the men debated blame and worried about their future, An Lee stood by the tainted well, her mind racing. She closed her eyes, shutting out the panicked voices, and listened instead to a different voice, the soft, steady voice of her mother from a memory years ago. They had been by a muddy, silt-choked stream after a flash flood. Her mother had dug a hole in the sand a few feet from the bank, then layered it with pebbles from the stream bed and crushed charcoal from their fire. She had poured the muddy water in, and An Lee had watched, mesmerized, as it seeped through the layers, emerging in the bottom of the hole as clean, clear water. "The earth knows how to heal itself," her mother had said. "You just have to help it." An Lee's eyes snapped open. She turned to Grant, her voice cutting through the growing clamor. "I can fix this." Gus scoffed. "Fix it? Girl, it's poisoned. We need a new well." Anli ignored him, her gaze locked on Grant. "It's an old way. My mother taught me. We can build a filter. Sand, gravel, charcoal. We can clean the water." The men stared at her as if she were mad. "That's old wives' tales, girl," Gus said, his skepticism returning with a vengeance. But Grant looked at her, at the fierce certainty in her eyes, at the intelligence that had already saved him a fortune. He had bet on her once and won. He would bet on her again. His voice rang out, silencing all dissent. "Do it. You have every man here. Tell them what you need." Anli didn't hesitate. Stepping into the authority Grant had given her, she began to issue orders. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight of knowledge that commanded respect. The men, initially doubtful, were swayed by her confidence and Grant's unwavering support. They set to work digging a series of large pits, hauling wagon loads of sand and gravel from a dry creek bed, and crushing charcoal from the fire pits. It was grueling, relentless work under the punishing sun. Anli was everywhere, her simple blue dress smudged with dirt and sweat, directing the placement of each layer, her hands as calloused and capable as any man's. She was no longer a consultant, she was a commander. On the second day, a carriage appeared on the horizon, a black speck shimmering in the heat. It was Beatrice and Clara, come from town to witness the camp's demise. They stood at a distance, their fine dresses and parasols a stark, ridiculous contrast to the grit and labor of the camp. Clara's laugh, high and sharp, carried on the wind. "Look at her," she called out, loud enough for all to hear, "playing in the mud like the peasant she is. I hope she enjoys the taste of failure." Anli heard her. The words were meant to be barbs, to wound and humiliate, but they had no effect. The girl who would have once shrunk under such scorn was gone. In her place was a woman with a purpose, a leader whose focus was absolute. She didn't even grant her stepsister a glance. She simply pointed to a section of the filtration bed. "More charcoal here. We need it thicker." The work continued, driven by a desperate, unifying hope. Late in the afternoon, they were ready. With the whole camp watching in tense silence, Anli directed the men to pour the first buckets of contaminated water into the system. It vanished into the top layer of sand, and they waited. An hour passed, then another. Just as dusk began to settle, a slow, steady trickle of water began to emerge from the output pipe at the bottom. It dripped into a clean bucket, clear as glass. Gus was the first to reach it. He stared at it, then dipped a tin cup into the bucket and raised it to his lips. He drank deeply. The camp held its breath. He lowered the cup, his flinty eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from the water to Anli, and a slow grin spread across his weathered face. He swept his hat from his head in a gesture of profound respect. "I'll be damned," he breathed. A ragged cheer erupted from the men, a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. The story of the water filter traveled faster than a horse. In Redemption Creek, it became the stuff of legend. Anli was no longer just the mayor's half-breed girl. She was the water witch of the plateau, a figure of ingenuity and power. The balance of power in the town had irrevocably shifted. Grant's project was not only saved, it was now seen as the most innovative and promising venture in the territory. This success attracted the attention of Mr. Davies, a shrewd and principled territorial official who had come to Redemption Creek to assess investment opportunities. He was far more impressed by Grant's sustainable methods and Anli's practical genius than by Mayor Thompson's blustering promises. With Davies' backing, Grant now had the leverage he needed. He also had proof, a sworn statement from one of the mayor's own men who had been paid to poison the well and had confessed out of guilt. The time for defense was over. It was time to confront the source of the rot. Grant and An Lee rode into town together, not as employer and employee, but as partners. They moved through the main street and people stared, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. The power couple they made was undeniable, his unbreachable strength and her quiet, unshakable intelligence. They found Mayor Thompson in his office, the same office where he had once held absolute power. But the room felt smaller now, his authority as faded as the wallpaper. Mr. Davies was already there, his presence lending an official, inescapable gravity to the proceedings. The mayor tried to bluster, his face flushed. He directed his venom at the person he had always seen as the weakest. "You ungrateful whelp," he snarled at An Lee, his voice trembling with impotent rage. "After all I've given you, a roof over your head, food in your belly, this is how you repay me? By siding with this outsider against your own family?" For years that voice had been enough to make her flinch, to make her invisible. Not anymore. She stood tall, her gaze steady, her voice clear and calm. "You gave me chores," she said, each word a carefully placed stone. "You gave me silence. You tried to make me invisible. But my mother gave me knowledge. And Grant," she looked at the big man beside her, "Grant gave me a choice." The final pieces fell into place, the confrontation from the hook now seen in its full damning context. Mayor Thompson, cornered and exposed, made one last desperate appeal to a tradition that no longer held sway. "You will not have her," he seethed, pointing a trembling finger at Grant. "She is a Thompson. She has a duty." His words were hollow, the pronouncements of a king who had lost his kingdom. Grant didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet certainty was more powerful than any shout. "She has a name," he repeated, the words of final judgment. "An Lee, and she made her choice." He said her name with a reverence that stripped away all the years of her father's neglect. He turned his gaze to An Lee, and in his eyes she saw not possession but partnership. She saw her future. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He laid a file on the mayor's desk. "Thompson," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "your political career in this territory is over. I suggest you begin settling your affairs." The mayor stared at the file, then at the three figures standing before him, the woman he had discarded, the man he had underestimated, and the official who represented the unyielding march of progress. He crumpled into his chair, a man utterly defeated, not by force of arms, but by the strength of a spirit he had tried and failed to break. The story did not end with his ruin, for An Lee's journey was never about revenge. It was about creation. Months later, as summer mellowed into a golden autumn, she stood with Grant on the porch of the small, sturdy house they were building on the plateau. Below them, the land was transforming. A green patchwork of experimental crops was taking hold near a newly dug reservoir, a testament to her knowledge and their shared work. The air was clean, the silence broken only by the wind and the distant sound of hammering from the growing settlement. She was wearing a new dress, a simple but well-made calico, the faded blue one finally retired. Grant came to stand beside her, taking her hand in his. Her fingers, still calloused from work, fit perfectly within his larger, stronger grasp. He didn't speak of love in flowery, poetic terms. It wasn't his way. Instead, he looked out at the burgeoning landscape, a slow smile touching his lips. "We have a lot of work to do," he said. It was a promise of a shared future, of building something lasting together, a life of purpose and mutual respect. An Lee looked at the horizon, where the setting sun painted the vast sky in strokes of orange and purple. She was no longer a shadow, no longer invisible. She was An Lee, and she was home.